Thank you, Einan. And we are starting with the first session. The first session will take us to the area of privacy and law. And this is my great honor to invite the one who leads this topic for the last several years here in our conference, and even before in all his global and academic involvement. My pleasure to invite Professor Michael Birenak to lead this session. Please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. This is the Senate Hall, and this is where our university's community has our discussions, sometimes very heated, so it's wonderful to have us discuss something else in this room. So it's a great pleasure to chair this session with wonderful scholars. I will invite them one by one because all have presentations. As you will see, their talks will supplement each other's. All our speakers deal with technology, one from a technological point of view, and the three others from a legal point of view, but intertwined with technology. One is a philosopher, the others are a computer scientist and a lawyer. We will discuss in this session privacy and artificial intelligence, AI. A few words about privacy in Israel, although this is not the topic of this session, but just to give you a context of what's going on in the place where we are. So, in a few words, Israel is not doing so good on the privacy front. Israel does currently have the status of adequacy awarded by the European Commission following the Israeli government's request about a decade ago. But under the GDPR, first time GDPR was mentioned today, it will probably be mentioned several more times. Under the GDPR, the EU Commission should reassess Israel's adequate status, and I am not sure what will happen with that. The Ministry of Justice, unfortunately, has failed and has not done much or hasn't done anything other than regulations on data security. The Knesset has done nothing. And the Data Protection Authority, apologies if there's some of my friends who work there in this room, but the Data Protection Agency in here, well, that is quite a sad story in how they have been handling this. The Ministry of Justice has been the Israeli Ministry of Justice has been communicating with the EU Commission about the status of Israel's adequacy, but it refuses to publish whatever reports it has sent there. So the overall status is, as I mentioned a minute ago, is not so good. Our speakers will not be discussing the Israeli privacy context, but of course issues of privacy, that's the same thing, and technology are not unique to Israel. The entire world has been discussing these issues, and our speakers will address different aspects thereof. So I will present them briefly in a short while. Woodrow Hartzog seems to have given up on the users to some extent as the source of protecting their own rights, and hence he focuses on design. Claudia Diaz follows or will follow and explains how technology can deal with a particular privacy issue, that of anonymity, which of course has important legal implications. Chris Hufnagel will turn from the users and the technology and direct law to the regulator operating the law in the American context and the growing power of the FTC in the privacy field. Eric Hilgendorf will turn our attention to the challenges of AI, and this brings our attention to yet another kind of regulatory modality, ethics. There's much discussion in recent years about data ethics, and Professor Hilgendorf will take us through that in the context of AI. So you can read about our speakers online and in the various applications, etc. So just a very brief introduction for each of them. There's much more to say in the order of their presentation. Professor Woodrow Hartzog is Professor of Law and Computer Science at Northeastern University School of Law and College of Computer and Information Science, and he's the author of this book. So it's not on sale, but not on sale here, but online, I guess, etc. On Privacy's Blueprint: The Battle to Control the Design of New Technologies. The second speaker will be Professor Claudia Diaz. She's an associate professor at KU Leuven in Belgium, where she's part of the COSIC research group of the Department of Electrical Engineering and leads the privacy technologies team over there. The third speaker will be Professor Chris Hufnagel, who's an adjunct professor at the School of Information and School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. And Chris is the author of this book about the Federal Trade Commission, privacy law and policy, which also is available online. I want the shares from the something there. Okay, and finally, our last speaker in the session would be Professor Eric Hilgendorf. Eric is the chair of the Research Center on Robotics Law at the University of Würzburg in Germany and is the member of the EU High Group on Artificial Intelligence. Each of them has about 20 minutes, and that hopefully will leave us some time for discussion at the end. So without any other further talking, our first speaker, Woody Hartzog, please.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to Michael and Ilana and everyone at Tel Aviv University and everyone here at Cyber Week for hosting. Let's see if I can, there we go. So today I'd like to talk about, let's see if I can find, is this the, there we go. So today I'd like to talk about my book, which Michael was very kind to bring up. And I want to start by telling a few stories. The first story, actually I want to start by making 3 points, which is relatively, I guess, straight to the point. One, we should know why design matters for privacy, because it matters more than I think most of us think we do. Two, which is the point of my book, privacy law should take design more seriously around the world, privacy regimes around the world, than it currently does. And three, one of the things that I'd really like to emphasize is that a design agenda should not have roots in data protection law, which may sound strange, but rather should have roots in surveillance law and what we might know of as consumer protection law. So what do I mean by that? Well, one, design matters for privacy. And by that, I mean that design is everywhere, design is power, and design is political. Let me tell you what I mean by that. First, take a look at this. Does anyone recognize this just by a mere show of hands, what this is? Anyone? A few people? Oh, this is great. I like it when people don't actually recognize what this is. So without knowing what this is, if you were to look at this with no other instruction, what might you think that this user interface is asking you to do? What is the function of this particular app? Yeah, there's a timer, right? What can you do? What is the timer perhaps indicating? Right, time to deletion, right? Deletion of what? Perhaps a photo, right? What are you supposed to do with the photo? You send it, right? All of this you can tell just by briefly looking at this user interface for a very short amount of time, right? Now, one of the things that I find to be very interesting about this photo is that there's an indication as to the kind of photo that you're supposed to be taking here, right? You can tell by the very carefully cropped timer, right, where we can't tell whether these young women have clothes on, with the implication being you can share things that are a little more naughty, perhaps, or a little more secretive or intimate, because after an amount of time, this photo will disappear, and you get to set what that is, and so you should share that with other people. And once you start looking at the ways in which design affects our privacy, you see it everywhere. Another example, so most people in the room probably know what this is, or many people. What is this? Google Glass, right? And you remember when it came out a few years ago, everyone said, "Oh, you're a glass hole if you wear this." And there was a design decision that was part of Google Glass that really, I think, affected it in a major way, and that was the decision to insert a camera onto Google Glass, right? Now, you may be saying, well, that's not that big of a deal. We have cameras everywhere. We have cameras in our pockets, right, everywhere we go. But there was another design decision that changed the way in which we saw that camera. And that was the fact that the camera was worn on your face, right? You could rest it right here. And it turns out that the difference between keeping a camera in your pocket at all times and having that camera readily available, even though it was a very short cost to pull it out and take the photo, is something that we value. Because people reacted negatively to the fact that a camera was pointing at them all the time with no cost whatsoever to pull it out and activate it. Right? So that was another design decision that you start to see everywhere. And then another one, this is also from Google. I'll give you a hint. Does anyone recognize this icon? It's changed a little. Right, it's from incognito mode, right? And you could tell, like, so if you were to not know what this was, right, but it popped up on your browser, you would probably know that this is meant to be somewhat protective and secretive. Why? The signals that this symbol is giving off, right? You've got the collar like turned up, you've got the hat drawn. This is the outfit of someone who does not want to be recognized, right? Does not want to be seen. And in fact, that's how incognito mode works, except it doesn't, right? And to Google's credit, when you open up incognito mode, there's a long list of people that can still see what you're doing online, even though you're using Google incognito mode. But without that, you might think that you were protected. And so these are the ways in which design, all sorts of design of digital technologies, affects our privacy in subtle ways that we don't think about from a day-to-day basis. The next point, and the reason why we should know why design matters, is that design is power. It distributes power within society and makes certain realities more or less likely. So the people that make decisions about our information technologies are yielding a kind of power. One of my favorite experiments that demonstrates this point is an experiment done by Leslie John and Alessandro Acquisi and a few others at Carnegie Mellon, where they got a group of people together to answer an online questionnaire. And this is what the one of the screens that they were faced when they sat down looked like. Now, when I put this up, what's the first thing you notice about this user interface? I'm sorry? I heard it. Yeah, the devil, right? There's a devil, right? And it's not a scary devil. It's like a cute devil, right? It's an emoji, like winky devil, right? And there are some other things that you might notice. How bad are you, right? With the text speak and the multiple exclamation points, as though it were sort of like a teenager that were sort of asking you this question. And there's one other thing that you immediately notice when you look at this. What's the font? Outmoded, right? This is Comic Sans font. And nothing serious in the history of the world has ever been written in Comic Sans font, right? But if you look at the questions, these questions are very probing. In fact, they're very revealing. They ask questions like, have you ever smoked marijuana? Have you ever cheated while in a relationship? Have you ever driven when you were pretty sure you were over the legal blood alcohol level? It is asking you to admit in engaging in criminal activity, right? But of course, the overall impression is not how bad are you, but rather, because when you have all of these design elements put together, how bad are you? You know you're bad. You're just a little bad, right? Everyone's a little bad. You can tell us. Now, here's the control group, right? Gone is our little winky devil emoji, replaced with the respectable imprimatur of Carnegie Mellon University. Gone is our Comic Sans font, replaced by a respectable sans serif font. Gone is the sort of how bad are you, replaced with the very sort of boring, university survey of student behaviors. And it turns out, and I don't want to misrepresent exactly their studies, but it turns out that people are almost 2 times more likely to say yes to revealing either illegal or potentially, at least debatably, immoral behavior with the casual user interface rather than the formal user interface. Design is power because it can make us reveal more simply by the way something looks, right? The signals that something is given off. And then the final aspect of design that I think is important to understand is that design is political. And I don't mean political in the sense of political parties, but I mean political with regard to who gets to choose how the power is distributed. One of the things, so when I started giving talks about this book earlier, one of the things I heard is that there's no such thing as a evil or bad technology. There are only evil or bad uses of those technologies. So I would say, well, the book is about regulating the design of information technologies, and a lot of the responses I would get is there are no bad technologies, only bad users. You wouldn't regulate knives, right? You wouldn't ban knives. Knives can be used to chop vegetables or to injure people, but it's not the fault of the knife, it's the fault of the person wielding the knife. With respect to digital technologies, I don't think that's true at all. I don't think there's any such thing as a neutral technology. That's because technologies are designed to effectuate certain realities in our world, right? Every single design decision is meant to facilitate a particular kind of action. That's why we call it a technology. Right? And so every design choice we make has moral implications. Some of them have bigger weight than others, but everything we do has some kind of weight. And as a result, it means that we have to take these design considerations seriously as a matter of law and policy. And right now, around the world, with respect to privacy, regimes are failing to do that. So, and then a lot of what I argue in the book is that privacy laws should take design more seriously. And for those that haven't had a privacy law course, so I teach information privacy law at my law school, I identify a privacy gap, and I identify a gap in basically it turns out there are really only 3 laws that you have to follow in all of privacy law. So we've got all these textbooks and classes and materials, but it turns out when it comes down to it, you just have to do 3 simple things, right? There's a design gap in all 3 of those simple rules. The first rule that really accounts for most data protection laws around the world is simply follow the fair information practices. So for those that haven't heard of it, the fair information practices are the building blocks for the general data protection regulation and basically every data protection regime around the world. It is things that you probably recognize. You should be transparent. You should give people notice about what their data is being collected, give them rights of rectification and deletion, only collect what you need, delete it when you're done, use it for particular purposes. These are the fair information practices. The problem with the fair information practices is that they almost always get distilled down to the simple notion that people should have control over their information. Now, maybe you're thinking, why is that a problem? That seems like a good thing. Control is something that I want over my personal information. The GDPR is built upon the notion of giving people control over their personal information. So why would you say that's a bad thing? Well, here's the deal. The way that control gets effectuated in the design of information technologies looks a lot like this, right? What is this? It's a toggle button, right? It's just... And it seems good. This particular mobile application would like to collect your geolocation. Green means yes. Gray means no. On, off. Control is effectuated. My privacy is respected. All is good. Right? Right. Except it's never just this button, is it? It's sort of situated in something like this, where we say, okay, Okay, so compass calibration, I say yes to that. Find my iPad, well, that's good. I want to do that. Location-based dyads, well, I don't know what that means, so I think I'll say no. Setting time zone, I guess that's good. And then we've got all these other things, and so we turn it off, and we spend a few minutes, and we get ourselves together, and we say, okay, now I feel good. Now my privacy has been respected because I have been put in control. It took a little while, but we finally got there. And then you take a deep breath, and you look back, and you say, oh, God, I've got a lot of work to do. The problem with thinking about privacy in terms of control is that if we are given our wish for more privacy, we get so much control that we choke on it. Design is used to overwhelm us and make that control meaningless, right? And abstracting it away doesn't help us either, right? Can you imagine distilling all of privacy down to one button that says, give me privacy, yes, right? Give me no privacy, no, right? That doesn't work either. And so there's almost no happy middle ground that we can find because we're either abstracting away risk or we're being so explicit that it overwhelms us. Okay, so the second rule in privacy that has a design gap is do not lie. As long as you're telling the truth, then you're being transparent, you're following the FIPS, and everything is good. The problem, of course, with that is that technical truth can easily be hidden in places where we're never going to find it. Right? So if you wanted to hide your deepest, darkest secret, where you knew that no one would ever find it, and you had to hide it somewhere online, where would you hide it? The terms of use, because no one would ever read it, right? No one's going to read that. No one should be expected to read that. It's overwhelming, and even if we did, we wouldn't understand it. And so we can use design to hide technical truth. And then finally, do not harm, right? The idea that we should not harm people, but the problem is that privacy harms are often the death by 1,000 cuts, rather than some obvious, big-time disclosure that would result in some sort of measurable harm. And so there's a design gap in all of these rules, right? And privacy regimes around the world are failing to account for it, which is what I try to answer, or at least provide some kind of resolution for in the book, which is a theory of privacy law and design. And I argue that there are three kinds of parts. There are three steps that you have to take in order to remedy privacy law's design gap. One is you have to articulate more specific privacy values, something beyond just privacy. You have to articulate boundaries, and then there are a series of tools that you can use to draw those boundaries. And what are the values? So I spend a lot of time in the book arguing that control is not the right goal for privacy law. It sounds intuitive, it sounds great, but it's going to get us to a place that we don't value. Instead, we should value trust, obscurity, and autonomy. Trust is one of the building blocks of modern society, right? So we should create rules that require companies to be trustworthy. And what I mean by that is they should be honest, they should be protective, they should be discreet, and most of all, the user interfaces that we interact with and our technologies that we use should be loyal to us, the user. In other words, they should not unreasonably engage in self-dealing on their own behalf at the expense of the user, and we can talk about what that means a little more. Another value that I try to develop a little in the book is the value of obscurity, which is a little less developed in the law. Obscurity is the idea that when things are hard to find or understood, they are relatively safe. And we spend most of our lives in zones of obscurity. When we walk down the streets, typically we're not expecting every single thing we do to be digitized and analyzed because even though we're in public, the odds of someone seeing us are relatively small. We gossip about our coworkers in public places, even though other people can hear us, because the odds of that getting back to our coworkers are small. And so in the book I spend a lot of time arguing that we should value obscurity better. And then finally I say we should value autonomy. Now, I know what you may be thinking, which is, well, didn't you just say that control is not the right goal? I argue that control is different than autonomy. Control sometimes serves autonomy, but when we are given too much of it, it can actually be corrosive to autonomy. In other words, it too often interferes with our ability to engage in informational self-determination. So we should focus on meaningful autonomy, not just the concept of control. And then finally, in the last half of the book, I talk about how a design agenda should have roots in consumer protection and surveillance law, and I give a few examples of boundaries that I talk about being deceptive design, abusive design, and dangerous design. And these are what I think are helpful ways of thinking about problematic kinds of design. Deceptive design is design that simply doesn't do what it promises, right? So when you click the Add Friends button, this is a case by the Federal Trade Commission, it shouldn't automatically download your entire contact book and send an email out to everyone asking you to join the social medium, even though that's what this particular social medium did. I talk a little bit about abusive behavior, which is possibly discriminatory algorithms or the use of double or triple negatives, for example. Like if you want someone to agree to terms, you shouldn't say, I don't not disagree to these terms of use, which is very confusing, even though it's possibly technically truthful. And then finally, I say we should watch out for dangerous design. And these are designs that simply are too risky based on the way that they're built. And so this is a spy camera. This is designed for basically one thing, which is voyeurism, right? And I argue in the book that this is actually a dangerous design, and things like spyware, for example, might be deserving of more robust regulation because of how dangerous it is. You don't have to go out regulating everything. You can have soft responses, moderate responses, or robust responses. Soft responses are just things like providing funding for better privacy education or privacy awareness. Moderate responses would be courts taking a better view of what privacy design, how it interacts in our lives. So for example, padlock icons, which are everywhere on the internet, what do those actually mean? And are courts actually taking account of design as they analyze a lot of things like contractual cases? And then finally, I spend the last part talking about what robust regulation might look like for things like spyware and facial recognition technologies. And in the end, I tried to map out what privacy's blueprint in action might look like, both for social media, what I call hide-and-seek technologies, and then the Internet of Things. So in summary, rules for privacy design should reflect human values beyond control, focus on signals and transaction costs. In other words, what does the design tell us, or what does the design make easier or harder? As a way of identifying what values are implicated, and then finally reflect a variety of soft, moderate, and robust responses. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.